The galaxy is a wound that will never close. It bleeds in every age, through every star system, through every faith that claims to heal it. Empires have risen and burned in the dark, their banners ground to dust by the slow, inevitable crush of time. And yet, through the millennia of unending war, one truth has remained immutable. The Imperium of Man endures, not because it is just, not because it is merciful, but because it is defended by those who will burn the galaxy itself before they allow it to fall. Among these defenders, none burn brighter, none burn purer, none burn more unyieldingly than the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the brides of the Emperor, the living pyres of his undying will. To speak of them is to speak of fire, not the careless flame of chaos and destruction, but the deliberate consuming blaze that scours corruption to the bone. They are warriors whose armour gleams like shrines, whose chants rise above the roar of bolters, whose eyes are lit by a faith that cannot be killed. To the unknowing, they may appear merely as soldiers. To the faithful, they are miracles in motion. And yet, their story is not one of perfect beginnings. The roots of the Adeptus Sororitas are tangled in betrayal, in manipulation, in the shadowed heart of the Imperium itself. They were not born from purity, but from corruption, shaped in the crucible of tyranny, tempered by revelation, and reforged into the unbreakable sword of the ecclesiarchy. In the time before their ascendance, the Imperium was already ancient, its star-spanning bureaucracy suffocating beneath its own weight. The Emperor had sat immobile upon the golden throne for 10,000 years, silent, his will interpreted, and often twisted, by the High Lords of Terror. Among these, the ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Ministorum, wielded the faith of countless billions as both shield and weapon. They claimed to speak the Emperor's will, but in truth they served their own survival, their own glory. The people believed because they had no choice. In a galaxy of nightmares, faith was the only light they could cling to. That light, however, could be turned into a torch to lead them, or a fire to burn them. It was in this climate of decayed piety that Gog Vandir rose to power. Vandir was no mere politician. He was a master of control, a man who understood that in the Imperium, faith was a currency far more valuable than gold, and fear a weapon far sharper than any blade. As both ecclesiarch and High Lord of the Administratum, he held two of the Imperium's most powerful offices at once, a violation of balance so absolute it should have shattered the system. But such was Vandir's charisma, such was his ruthlessness, that no one dared move against him. His reign, later named the Age of Apostasy, would be written in blood. It was during Vandir's consolidation of power that he learned of a secluded sect of warrior women on the remote world of San'leor. They called themselves the Daughters of the Emperor, and they lived a life of martial discipline and religious purity, untouched by the corrupt politics of the wider Imperium. They wielded blade and bow in the defence of their faith, but had never set foot upon a battlefield beyond their world. To Vandir they were a gift from the Emperor himself, not as defenders of truth, but as a symbol he could corrupt and weaponize. Vandir's arrival on San'leor was a spectacle of calculated sanctity. He came not as a conqueror but as a pilgrim, bearing relics and blessings, his voice honeyed with promises of service to the Emperor's will. The daughters, seeing in him the highest voice of the faith, welcomed him as a holy emissary. In truth, he saw only their devotion, their discipline, and their beauty, tools he could bend to his will. Through ceremony and flattery, he bound them to his cause, naming them his personal bodyguard, the brides of the Emperor. They accepted the title without hesitation, believing themselves honoured to serve so closely to the Emperor's chosen. In those days, their armour was ceremonial, their weapons simple, but their hearts were already harder than ceramite. They learned quickly the arts of war that Vandir's campaigns demanded, purges against supposed heretics, suppression of dissent on shrine worlds, the execution of imperial commanders whose loyalty he deemed suspect. They fought with absolute conviction, never questioning his commands, for to them, disobedience was disobedience to the Emperor himself. Vandir's genius was complete. He had wrapped lies in the cloth of faith, and the daughters had become his perfect instrument. Yet the galaxy is vast, and the truth cannot be buried forever. As Vandir's tyranny deepened, resistance began to coalesce. The Adeptus Mechanicus grew wary of his overreach. The Imperial Guard bled in endless, unnecessary wars, Even the Inquisition began to whisper of treachery. Civil war ignited across the Imperium, not between Xenos and man, nor between heretic and loyalist, but between factions of the Imperium itself. Vandir, in his paranoia, tightened his grip, and the brides became the steel around his throne, an unbreakable wall of flesh and faith that no assassin, no coup could pierce. It is in these years, the height of the reign of blood, that the contradictions at the heart of the Adeptus Sororitas genesis burn brightest. They were defenders, yet they destroyed without mercy. They were servants of the Emperor, yet they enforced the will of a man who perverted his name. And yet, for all the blood they spilled at Vandir's command, their faith in the Emperor himself never wavered. They were deceived, but not corrupted. This would prove the fulcrum on which their entire future turned. For if Vandir had underestimated anything, it was the fragility of a lie once light is shone upon it. That light would come from the most unexpected of sources, the Adeptus, custodes themselves, the golden wardens of the Emperor's palace. As the civil war drew closer to Terra, the custodes emerged from the Imperial Palace for the first time in centuries. They did not come to bargain, nor to debate, but to end the reign of blood. Yet even they, with all their mastery of war, could not breach the ecclesiarchal palace so long as the brides defended it. The custodes knew that to kill them was to kill innocents, innocents whose faith could yet be redeemed. So they sought another way. In an act of quiet audacity, they requested an audience with the leader of the brides. She met them in the shadowed halls, flanked by her sisters, bolters at the ready, eyes cold with duty. The custodian simply said, "Come and see." She agreed, suspicious but bound by an honour she did not yet know would destroy her illusions. The custodes led her through the war-ravaged streets, through the gates of the Imperial Palace itself, into the silent sacred chambers where the Emperor's golden form sat upon the throne. In that moment, all the lies fell away. She beheld not the distant, abstract Emperor of sermons, but the reality, the corpse god who had sacrificed his mortal form to save humanity 10,000 years ago, and who had never spoken again. She knew then that Vandir had never been his voice. The revelation was a blade driven into her heart, and a flame lit within her soul. She returned to her sisters, not with commands, but with truth. The brides turned their weapons away from the custodes, away from Vandir's enemies, and upon the false ecclesiarch himself. When Vandir was confronted, his madness was laid bare. Some say he laughed, some say he ranted about his divine mandate. The most enduring account is that he looked upon the custodies and his former brides, smiled and said, "Very well. I shall die knowing I was right," and then they killed him. The reign of blood ended not with an army's triumph, but with a revelation and a single execution. The brides of the Emperor were no more, but from their ashes something greater would rise, a force no longer bound to the will of any man, no longer blinded by the trappings of power. They would serve the Emperor directly, their faith untainted, their fire undimmed. The galaxy would come to know them by another name, one that would echo in both terror and awe across 10,000 battlefields, the Adeptus Sororitas. Yet their birth raises a question that lingers still. If they were forged in deception, does that deception taint their purpose? Or does the purity of their faith, tested and proven in the crucible of betrayal, make them stronger than any force born in truth? The Imperium does not ask such questions openly. But the Sisters of Battle know the answer they have chosen, and they will burn the galaxy to prove it. The death of Gog Vandir would one day be remembered as inevitable. In truth, for much of his reign, it seemed unthinkable. His was an authority, so complete that even the High Lords of Terror, those ancient stewards of the Emperor's realm, feared to act against him. The Age of Apostasy did not begin with a single act of treachery, but with the slow, patient accumulation of power. A spider's web spun across the galaxy, each thread a soul bought, a faith twisted, a duty corrupted. Vandir understood the Imperium's greatest weakness, that its people could endure almost anything so long as they believed it was the Emperor's will. And so he became the Emperor's will. At first his ascension was dressed in the familiar garments of piety and reform. Corruption in the administratum was purged with executions broadcast across planetary networks. Cardinals accused of decadence were paraded through the streets before the masses. Public works projects raised vast cathedrals and shrines, not only on holy worlds, but even on backwater agri-planets, their spires visible for hundreds of kilometers. Vander spoke of a new age of unity, of unyielding faith, of a galaxy remade in the Emperor's image. Billions believed him. Perhaps he believed himself. But purity enforced through fear corrodes faster than the corruption it claims to burn away. His reforms became edicts, his edicts became decrees, and his decrees became death warrants. The ecclesiarchy had always been a power in the Imperium, but under Vandir it became an empire unto itself, enforcing loyalty not through the slow grind of doctrine but through fire and the blade. Planets whose tithes were late burned, governors who failed to attend his sermons were excommunicated, their worlds declared heretic and besieged. Those who questioned his word vanished, not in secret but publicly, their executions transformed into ritual sacrifices before the altar of his ambition. It was in this climate that the brides of the Emperor found their purpose sharpened to a killing edge. Once the ornamental guardians of the ecclesiarch's presence, they became his enforcers across the stars. Clad in gleaming plate bearing the aquila upon their breast, they were both terror and inspiration to the faithful. Wherever Vandir's word was doubted, the brides descended from orbit, their transports landing amidst fire and hymn. Their arrival was the voice of the Emperor made manifest, or so the people believed. In truth, it was Vandir's will they served, their every campaign a thread tightening around the throat of the Imperium. Sanctified war became a constant rhythm. Hive worlds erupted in rebellion when taxes rose beyond endurance. The brides put them to the torch, leaving blackened ruins where teeming billions had lived. Frontier planets harboured refugees from Vandir's purges. The brides burned them from their hiding places, their voices raised in hymns as the pyres lit the night. To the sisters themselves, these acts were necessary purifications, their blades cutting away the gangrenous flesh of heresy. Few realised that Vandir's definition of heresy was whatever threatened his grip on power. And yet, there was a terrible efficiency to it. Vandir's Imperium did not stagnate. Trade routes cleared of dissent flowed with goods and tithes. Shrine worlds shone with golden spires visible from orbit. Even the war against the alien was prosecuted with renewed vigour, though Vandir saw such campaigns less as defence of humanity and more as theatre to display his reign's supposed righteousness. The brides fought in these wars too, against Eldar corsairs, against orc-raiding fleets, against the creeping tendrils of tyrannid splinter forces. In each battle, their discipline and ferocity impressed even hardened Imperial Guard commanders. In them, Vandir had forged an army both beautiful and terrible, loyal beyond reason, immune to fear, and blind to his sins. The machine of his reign, however, was too vast and too greedy to run forever without devouring itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus grew restless at his interference in their Forge World's governance. The navigators whispered of forbidden ship seizures and the redirection of entire fleet convoys for ecclesiarchal purposes. The Administratum, his supposed domain, began to fracture under the impossible demands for resources, tithes, and political allegiance. Most dangerous of all, the Inquisition, that shadowed brotherhood that answers only to the Emperor, began to take notice. The first sparks of open resistance came from the fringes. Small uprisings in distant sectors were crushed quickly, but the embers spread. In the Segmentum Tempestus, a coalition of governors refused Vandir's decrees and declared themselves loyal directly to the Emperor. In the Segmentum Obscurus, an inquisitorial conclave pronounced the ecclesiarch a danger to the Imperium's stability. These declarations did not bring negotiation but reprisal. Vandir dispatched fleets, the brides at their vanguard, to scour the disloyal from existence. Entire star systems vanished beneath the shadow of his wrath. It was during these campaigns that the Reign of Blood earned its name. The chronicles of this era, even those preserved by the ecclesiarchy after Vandir's fall, speak of oceans of blood shed in his name. The brides, still unaware of their manipulation, became both executioner and symbol, their presence on the battlefield a promise of annihilation for any who resisted. Many commanders swore that no force in the galaxy could match their zeal. In truth, their greatest strength was not in bolter or blade, but in the unwavering conviction that their cause was holy. And yet, the greater the slaughter, the greater the doubt it sowed. Some Imperial Guard officers, having fought beside the brides, began to question why their fury was so often turned inward, against humanity itself. Certain planetary priests, once eager to see Vandir's emissaries arrive, began to hide their relics and shun ecclesiarchal visits. In the depths of the Inquisition, plans formed for a direct intervention. Civil war on a galactic scale was no longer a question of if, but when. When it came, it was unlike any other war in Imperial history. This was not a crusade against alien threat, nor a rebellion of chaos cults, but a war within the Imperium's own heart. Fleets loyal to Vandir clashed with those sworn to the Emperor's other servants. Planetary governors fortified against one another. The Adeptus Mechanicus split, some for Vandir, some against. The schism ran not only through worlds but through families, brother against brother, sister against sister, each claiming the Emperor's favour. Vandir's genius for manipulation had built a realm in which every act could be justified as holy, and thus every atrocity committed without hesitation. The brides became the immovable pillar of his defence. No assassin reached him, no mutiny touched his throne room, no siege breached his inner sanctum, for the sisters stood before him in their thousands, a wall of living faith. Even the Inquisition hesitated to strike directly, knowing that to kill them would be to slaughter those who, in another age, might be among the Emperor's greatest defenders. The custodes watched from within the Imperial Palace, silent as the void, until the moment they judged the time was right. That moment came when terror itself began to burn. Vandir's enemies gathered at the cradle of the Imperium, their fleets hammering the defences of the Sol system. The siege was slow, grinding, its battles fought across void and orbital platform in the dark between planets. It is said that Vandir in those days spoke rarely, his paranoia grown into something like prophecy. He claimed the Emperor guided him in every act, that the blood flooding the streets was the price of humanity's salvation. His brides believed him still, until the custodes acted. They did not storm the palace. They did not fight the brides. Instead, they spoke. In a meeting whose details remain obscured in the mists of history, they convinced the leader of the brides to see the Emperor with her own eyes. Perhaps they appealed to her sense of honour. Perhaps they simply told her the truth, that if she did not come, the war would tear terror apart. Whatever the reason, she agreed. And when she saw him, silent and unmoving upon the golden throne, she knew. It was the end of Vandir's reign the moment she returned. The bride's ranks split, not in violence, but in purpose. Their weapons turned away from Vandir's enemies and toward Vandir himself. He was cornered in his own sanctum, his most loyal defenders now standing in silent judgment beside the custodes. When the killing blow came, it was swift. His body was burned, his name struck from honour rolls, his deeds declared heresy. But the blood he had spilled could not be washed away. The reign of blood had ended, but it had carved scars deep into the Imperium's soul. Billions were dead, sectors depopulated, faith shaken and yet paradoxically hardened. The brides, now unbound from Vandir's will, faced the truth of what they had done, and what they could yet become. They had been the blade of a tyrant. Now they would be the sword of the Emperor himself. From the fires of civil war, the Adeptus Sororitas were ready to be born. The end began not with the roar of bolter fire, but with the opening of a door. For years, the ecclesiarchal palace had been an impregnable bastion, its gates locked behind the faith and fury of the brides of the Emperor. Armies had broken upon its walls, assassins had vanished in its shadowed halls. Vandir had ruled from its sanctum like a god enthroned, his voice carried on the lips of billions, his will enforced by those who would kill for him without hesitation. But even the strongest fortress can be breached when its defenders no longer believe. The custodes had waited for that moment, patient as stone, and when it came, they acted without hesitation. The siege of the ecclesiarchal palace had already ground into its second year. The sky above Terra was scarred with the debris of shattered fleets. The void patrols stretched thin to keep hostile warships from the inner system. On the surface, the streets of the Holy City ran with blood. Vandir's loyalists, Fraterus Templars, elements of the Imperial Guard and the brides themselves, held the palace grounds with fanatical determination. The attackers were no less relentless. Forces aligned with the rebellious High Lords, inquisitorial strike teams, even contingents of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had turned against Vandir's growing interference. Yet no matter how fierce the fighting became, the inner gates did not fall. They could not. The brides stood there, an unyielding wall of ceramite and faith. They fought not for Vandir the man, but for the emperor they believed he represented. So long as that belief remained unshaken, the palace might endure forever. The custodians understood this. They knew the palace could only be taken by changing the will of its guardians. The Captain General of the Custodes himself led the approach. It is said he entered the palace without drawing his blade, his golden armour gleaming even in the half-light of the siege-shrouded skies. The brides lowered their weapons only enough to let him pass, their eyes wary but not hostile. He requested audience with their leader, a woman whose name has been lost to history, perhaps deliberately, as if to make her stand for all who wore the habit and armour of the Emperor's brides. She agreed, if only to hear why the Emperor's own guard would come to her in this hour. The meeting took place in a chamber lined with stained glass and sanctified relics, the air heavy with the scent of burning incense. The custodian did not waste words. "Come and see," he said, his voice steady, neither a plea nor a command. She asked no questions, sensing in his bearing the weight of something beyond, the petty politics of the High Lords. She followed him in silence, her most trusted sisters at her side, bolters still in their hands. They walked through the war-torn streets of terror, past barricades manned by Imperial Guard regiments who saluted the custodes with something like awe. They crossed the threshold of the Imperial Palace, its gates opening at the Captain General's gesture, and entered the sanctum that few living souls had ever seen. There, amidst the endless machinery and the silent ranks of the companions, she beheld the golden throne. It is said she fell to her knees without thinking, the sheer magnitude of his presence overwhelming her. The Emperor did not speak. He has not spoken for 10,000 years, but his truth was undeniable. She saw the reality for what it was. The master of mankind was no distant voice whispering through Vandir, but a silent, immortal sentinel holding back the darkness by his mere existence. Everything she had believed about Vandir's divine authority crumbled to dust in that instant. There was only the Emperor, and there had only ever been the Emperor. She returned to the palace not as Vandir's servant, but as his executioner. Her first act was to summon the commanders of the brides. In the shadow of the sanctum, with the echo of the throne still burning in her mind, she told them the truth. There was no argument, no schism. One by one they lowered their weapons. They would not kill their ecclesiarch out of politics or vengeance. They would kill him because he had blasphemed against the Emperor by placing himself in his stead. When Vandir learned that his brides had turned, he did not flee. Accounts vary on what passed in those final hours. Some say he raged, accusing them of betrayal and damning them in the Emperor's name. Others claim he laughed, declaring that he had always known the day would come and that history would prove him right. The most enduring tale, perhaps because it captures the arrogance that defined his reign, is that he looked upon the custodies and the women who had once been his shield and said, "Very well, I shall die knowing I was right." Moments later, the chamber was silent but for the echo of bolter fire. His body was burned. His name was struck from ecclesiarchal rolls, his likeness destroyed wherever it was found. The Inquisition scoured the records of his rule, ensuring that only his crimes remained in history's memory. But no fire could erase the scars he had left upon the Imperium. Worlds lay in ruin, populations decimated, faith both shaken and radicalized. Billions had died in the wars fought in his name, their blood a tide that could never be washed away. In the aftermath, the Imperium faced a paradox. The brides of the Emperor had been Vandir's most faithful servants, his most effective killers, and yet they had also been the instrument of his downfall. They had fought for him without question, but when confronted with the Emperor's truth, they had turned without hesitation. It was the purity of their faith, even when misdirected, that had made them dangerous under Vandir. And that same purity would make them invaluable to the Imperium reborn from the reign of Blood's ashes. The High Lords of Terror, chastened by the Civil War, sought to ensure that no ecclesiarch would ever again command such personal military power. The decree passive was passed into law, forbidding the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. But law is as much about interpretation as intent. Sebastian Thor, the new ecclesiarch chosen for his humility and wisdom, saw the opening. The decree forbade men under arms, but said nothing about women. Thus, the brides could remain, not as the personal guard of a tyrant, but as the Adeptus Sororitas, the orders militant of the ecclesiarchy, bound only to the emperor and the purity of his faith. It was a transformation both symbolic and practical. The name Brides of the Emperor was set aside, its association with Vandaia too heavy to bear. The Sororitas were divided into great orders militant, each with its own patron saint, its own holy charge. Their armour was refashioned, their war gear refined, their vows renewed in ceremonies that spoke not of loyalty to any mortal, but of eternal service to the Emperor alone. The memory of their past service to Vandaia was not erased. It was preserved as a lesson, a scar upon their honour that would forever remind them of the cost of misplaced faith. The final act of this transformation came in the form of a pilgrimage. Leaders of the newly formed orders journeyed to the Golden Throne, kneeling before it just as their forebear had in the hour of revelation. The custodes watched in silence as they swore oaths of service that no mortal could command, oaths bound not to voice or vision, but to the undying presence upon the throne. And from that day onward, the Sororitas became the living embodiment of the ecclesiarchy's militant faith, warriors who would burn the galaxy clean of heresy, yet never again be the tools of a single man's ambition. The fall of Vandaia was thus not merely the end of a tyrant, but the birth of something far more enduring. His reign had been built on deception, but the fire it lit within the Sisters of Battle could not be extinguished. They had seen the truth, they had chosen the truth, and in the centuries to come, that truth would march to war clad in ceramite and hymn, a tide of fire and faith that would leave its mark on every battlefield it touched. Yet, in the quiet moments between wars, some among the sisters must have asked themselves, if they had not been shown the Emperor with their own eyes, would they still serve Vandaia? The question has no answer, for history allows no second chances. What remains is the vow born of that revelation, a vow that the Sororitas have kept for millennia. They will serve no man's will, only the Emperor's. They will never again be deceived, and they will burn any who would dare try. The tide of the sisterhood's influence did not spread in silence. It moved like the light of a dawn, slow yet unstoppable, casting long shadows as it advanced. Across the breadth of the Imperium, from the glittering spires of the Segmentum Solar to the far-flung bastions at the edge of the halo stars, the Adeptus Sororitas became a presence both feared and revered. Pilgrims whispered prayers to them as living avatars of the God Emperor's will. Planetary governors learned to measure their ambitions against the unyielding wall of ecclesiarchal law they carried in their wake. For in every theatre where the sisters marched, there came both salvation and scrutiny, and not all who looked upon their banners felt joy. What began as the restoration of a loyal arm of the ecclesiarchy had, in mere decades, evolved into a formidable political force. Orders once limited to the protection of shrines now found themselves petitioned to intervene in disputes between noble houses, to suppress cult uprisings before the Arbites could respond, to judge whether the faith of an entire planet was sufficiently pure to warrant ecclesiarchal favour. These petitions came not because the Adeptus Sororitas sought such authority, but because their reputation for incorruptibility and swift righteous judgment had outstripped even that of the Emperor's other servants. In the eyes of many their word was the Emperor's word. Yet every victory they claimed, every heretic burned, and every shrine defended also carried the weight of precedent. What the sisters enforced once, they would be expected to enforce again. What heresy they crushed on one world would inevitably be compared to the blasphemies tolerated elsewhere. Quietly, subtly, they were being drawn into the Imperium's endless web of politics, a web as dangerous as any battlefield. The enemies they faced were no longer only the mutants, witches, and apostates who blasphemed openly, but also the whispered intrigues of planetary rulers who cloaked their ambitions in piety, and inquisitors whose definition of heresy was as mutable as the tides of war. The convent prioress upon Terra became a nerve centre of this expanding sphere of influence. Couriers arrived daily from every segmentum bearing reports that mixed battlefield chronicles with theological verdicts. It was here that canoness superiors and prioresses met in vaulted chambers, lit by the cold light of Terra's polluted sky, speaking in tones heavy with the knowledge that their decisions would echo across hundreds of systems. From the marble floor, mosaics depicting the Emperor's triumph over the arch-traitor, to the towering reliquaries that held the bones of martyred saints, the convent exuded an air of permanence and divine sanction. It was a place where mortal voices dared to speak in the name of an immortal god. Among the most significant developments of this era was the growing coordination between the Order's militant and the non-militant branches of the Sisterhood. The Order's Hospitaller, long devoted to the care of the sick and the wounded, began travelling alongside the Battle Sisters in ever greater numbers. Their presence softened the harsh image of the militant orders, for wherever the Sisters cleansed a world in flame, the Hospitallers brought balm and relief. In the aftermath of battle, they tended to loyal citizens with the same dedication with which their sisters had hunted heretics, creating a cycle of fear, awe, and gratitude that bound whole populations more tightly to the ecclesiae. Likewise, the Order's dialogues, masters of language and diplomacy, became invaluable in managing the complex interplay of faith and politics. They translated not only human dialects, but also the subtle nuances of doctrine, ensuring that the Emperor's truth was spoken with precision and without room for dangerous interpretation. It was the dialogues who mediated disputes between newly converted worlds and the more conservative bastions of the Imperium, ensuring unity where division might have festered. The Order's Famulus too found their role expanding, advising noble families on alliances, marriages, and inheritance in ways that subtly aligned secular power with the ecclesiarchy's vision. This expansion of the Sisterhood's presence brought them into more frequent contact, and sometimes friction, with the Inquisition. While many inquisitors valued the Adeptus Sororitas as incorruptible allies, others saw them as dangerously independent. The Inquisition tolerated no rival authority in matters of heresy, and while the Sisters' loyalty to the Emperor was unquestionable, their loyalty to the ecclesiarchy was less palatable to those who operated outside its hierarchies. There were whispers, always suppressed but never entirely silenced, that some inquisitors resented the Sisters' refusal to be co-opted into inquisitorial retinues without the explicit sanction of their prioresses. Tensions flared most often in the shadowy campaigns against the Imperium's internal enemies, cults, rogue psychers, and seditious sects whose crimes could be seen as either theological or political, depending on who judged them. The Sisters brought the fire of faith, the Inquisition brought the cold precision of sanctioned paranoia. These differences in approach could prove combustible. A notable example was the incident on the shrine world of Dalmora, where an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus ordered the execution of the planet's entire priesthood, on suspicion of tainted visions. The local Order militant refused the command, citing insufficient proof and the danger of extinguishing 1,000 years of sanctioned worship. The standoff was resolved only after a months-long theological tribunal. But the memory of Dalmora lingered in both institutions, each side privately convinced that it had been in the right. Yet such conflicts were the exception, not the norm. More often, the Sisters and the Inquisition worked in grim harmony, their combined might enough to shatter even the most entrenched heresies. In the purgation of the Haxos cluster, the Sisters of the Order of the Argent Shroud fought alongside an inquisitorial task force to cleanse a chain of worlds whose governors had fallen to the worship of the dark gods. For 7 years they burned, purified, and rebuilt, leaving behind not only ruined cities, but also fortified shrines, each one a beacon of imperial faith. The cost was terrible, but the Haxos cluster emerged as one of the most devout regions of the Segmentum Obscurus, its surviving populations seeing the Sisters not merely as warriors, but as saviours. This was the paradox of the Adeptus Sororitas in their age of expansion. They were both the Emperor's unyielding sword and his merciful hand. They brought annihilation to the guilty and salvation to the loyal, often in the same day, and it was this duality that made them indispensable to the Imperium's survival. Worlds burned under their guns even as they were uplifted by their presence. Faith deepened in the shadow of their wars. Still, with influence came danger. The Adeptus Sororitas were bound by the decree passive to remain within the spiritual domain of the ecclesiarchy, forbidden from wielding political or military power in their own right. In practice, however, their authority often exceeded that of the very governors and generals they worked alongside. This tension was not lost on the High Lords of Terror, who watched the Sisterhoods rise with interest, and, in some cases, unease. To some, the Sisters were a necessary counterweight to the excesses of the Inquisition and the political games of the noble houses. To others, they were a reminder that power, once amassed, is rarely relinquished willingly. And so the Adeptus Sororitas marched on, across the stars, across the centuries, their flames lighting the void, their hymns echoing in the silence between worlds. They brought unity where there had been division, purpose where there had been doubt, but every step forward wove them deeper into the Imperium's great tapestry of power, and every thread in that tapestry could one day be pulled. For in the grim darkness of the far future, no flame burns without casting a shadow, and the brighter the fire of the sisterhood blazed, the more certain it became that the shadows would one day rise to meet it. The Adeptus Sororitas are not merely an armed order, they are a living, breathing testament to the Emperor's will, crystallized into human form and refined by centuries of unyielding doctrine. Their culture is not a thing of casual inheritance, it is forged, day by day, in the crucible of prayer, obedience, and bloodshed. From the youngest novitiate to the most battle-scarred canoness, each sister moves through a life shaped by relentless discipline and an unshakable certainty that her existence is but a vessel for divine purpose. Every sister begins her journey as a child of the scholar progenium, orphaned by war, purged by faith, and sculpted into obedience before she even knows the word for rebellion. In the echoing halls of these institutions, under the watch of drill abbesses and confessors, the young girls destined for the sororitas are instructed not only in combat and theology, but in the fusion of the two into a single identity. They are taught that every breath is prayer, every motion service, and every act, whether tending a wounded ally or incinerating a heretic, is but another note in the Emperor's eternal hymn. It is here that the seeds of the Adepta's unique culture take root. Faith is not a companion to the sword, it is the sword. The formal structures of the Adeptus Sororitas are divided into the great orders, militant, dialogus, famulus, and hospitaller, each with its own sacred function. The orders militant are the most visible and feared, their names carved into history through wars of flame and sanctified steel. They are the chamber militant of the ecclesiarchy, answering to the cardinals and ultimately to the ecclesiarch himself, though in practice they obey only the dictates of their canonesses and the unassailable truth of the imperial creed. Each order militant has its own fortress convent, a sanctified bastion where relics are enshrined, litanies are whispered without ceasing, and the unbroken cycles of training and devotion never falter. Their hierarchy is precise, for in the eyes of the sororitas, order is the armour of the soul. At the apex of an order stands the canoness superior, a figure of unyielding command whose word is as binding as scripture. Beneath her are the canonesses preceptor and commander, each directing divisions of sisters across worlds and war zones. Below them, palatines lead small detachments into the crucible of battle, while sister superiors guide their squads as both spiritual shepherds and martial commanders. In this structure, no rank is merely administrative. Every position carries the weight of spiritual guardianship, and every command is an act of worship. Doctrine is the marrow of the sororitas. It is etched into their lives through the rule of the orders, a codex of martial theology blending liturgical law with battlefield pragmatism. The Emperor is not a distant deity to them. He is a commander to be obeyed without hesitation, a source of infinite inspiration and the embodiment of victory itself. Their prayers are as tactical as they are devotional. Litanies are recited not to soothe the soul, but to steel the will, to banish hesitation, to focus the eye on the only truth that matters, that they are His will made flesh, and His will cannot fail. Even their war gear is sanctified through ritual. The bolter is no mere firearm, it is the instrument of the Emperor's judgment, blessed with sacred oils, its machine spirit coaxed into obedience through the recitation of the Catechism of Fire. The flamer is a relic of purgation, its roaring promethium seen as a reflection of holy wrath. The melter is an icon of absolute annihilation, deployed when heresy's stain demands not just death, but unmaking. Each suit of power armour is a reliquary in itself, adorned with purity seals, inscribed with prayers, and often containing fragments of sacred relics within its ceramite plates. To a sister, to don this armour is to step into a shrine from which she will bring death to the enemies of the Emperor. Yet for all their discipline and martial focus, the sororitas are not an army in the Imperial Guard's sense. They are not bound to the strategies of mere generals. They are a weapon wielded by the ecclesiarchy with precision and zeal. They do not conquer for territory, but for the soul. A sororitas campaign does not end when the last enemy stronghold falls. It ends when the last heretic is burned, when the last blasphemous text is reduced to ash, When the Emperor's light shines unchallenged across the field of war, this single-mindedness is cultivated through rites that bind the sisterhood into an unbreakable whole. At dawn, the first act of every convent is the Mass of Consecration, in which the sisters kneel in full armour before the altar, reciting the litany of the martyred saints, each name a reminder of the price of faltering. Meals are eaten in silence while scripture is read aloud, so that even sustenance becomes an act of devotion. Before battle, the rite of the sacred arsenal is performed, each weapon inspected, blessed, and claimed with an oath sworn in the Emperor's name, and after battle the vigil of the fallen is held, where the dead are named and their deeds retold so that they live forever in the memory of the Order. The philosophy underpinning all this is unyielding. The universe is a sea of sin and darkness, and only through absolute purity of faith can humanity survive. The Sororitas do not believe in redemption for the unrepentant. Their mercy is swift to death, their compassion the sparing of a soul from further corruption. To outsiders this may appear cruel, even fanatical, but to the sisters it is the purest form of love, to prevent the heretic from damning themselves further, to protect the faithful from infection, to serve the Emperor without compromise. And yet, for all their rigid certainty, there exists within their doctrine a thread of personal conviction, a space in which the individual sister's devotion takes on a unique shape. Some are scholars of the faith, able to recite obscure parables to inspire their comrades in the darkest hour. Others are warriors who see every swing of their chainsword as a psalm. Still others are healers, their touch as sanctified as their trigger finger, bringing life to the faithful so they may fight again in his name. These differences are not divisions, they are facets of a single diamond, each catching the light of the Emperor's will in its own way. The orders. Dialogus serve as the voice and ear of the ecclesiarchy in matters of language and law, fluent in tongues both human and Xenos, deciphering ancient texts to uncover hidden truths or unmask heretical corruption. The orders Famulus act as the Emperor's silent hand in the courts and palaces of the Imperium, shaping noble lineages to ensure loyalty to the creed. The orders Hospitaller tend to the wounded in body and spirit, often accompanying the orders militant into battle, their apothecaries moving fearlessly through hails of fire to reach the fallen. Together these branches form the totality of the Adeptus' reach, on the battlefield, in the library, in the chapel, and in the shadowed corridors of power. Their technology is not of their own design. Like much of the Imperium, it is inherited, venerated, and maintained through rites, whose origins may be as ancient as the age of apostasy itself. The Sororitas' relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus is one of necessity rather than intimacy. Tech priests maintain their sacred war gear, but always under the watchful eyes of sisters who ensure no unholy deviation enters the purity of their arms. Relics such as the Simulacra Imperialis, portable shrines carried into war, or the blessed standards embroidered with the victories of centuries past, are as much weapons as their bolters and flamers, for they carry the power to ignite the faith of every soul who beholds them. At the heart of the Adeptus Sororitas' way of war lies the belief that morale is as vital as munitions. A single sister, her armour gleaming, her voice ringing with the words of the creed, can inspire a regiment of guardsmen to hold a line they would otherwise abandon. Their presence on the battlefield is a living reminder that the Emperor watches, that failure is not an option, and that faith can overcome even the most impossible odds. The enemies of the Imperium have felt this weight. Chaos champions have faltered under the burning gaze of a canoness, and alien warlords have seen their armies crumble, not from lack of strength, but from the breaking of their will before the unshakable advance of the sisters. And still, there is an undercurrent to their culture, one not often spoken aloud, the knowledge that they are both the shield and the torch of the Imperium's soul. If they falter, it is not merely a battle lost, it is a step toward the darkness reclaiming mankind. This awareness is a constant pressure, a quiet, crushing gravity that only strengthens their resolve. For in the galaxy's endless night, the Adeptus Sororitas are the fire that will not go out. And yet, even the brightest flame casts shadows. What happens when the unyielding becomes inflexible, when certainty blinds as much as it guides? The answer lies in the wars to come, where the Adeptus' creed will be tested not only by heretics and Xenos, but by the very Imperium they swore to defend. War had always been the crucible in which the Adeptus Sororitas proved themselves, yet there were wars, and there were wars. There were the endless campaigns against orc infestations in the Segmentum Tempestus, the purges of heretic enclaves hidden within the hives of Necromunda, the reclamation of shrine worlds overrun by apostate warlords. These were battles fought in the Emperor's name, bitter and brutal, yet familiar in their rhythm, threats identified, targeted, and burned away with bolter and flamer. But there were conflicts in which that rhythm broke, when the firestorm of faith met not resistance, but a storm vast enough to threaten its very source. In the later centuries of M38, the Sororitas were drawn into such storms with increasing frequency as the Imperium itself began to strain under the weight of its millennia-long siege. It began with subtle tremors. Administratum reports whispered of worlds where the ecclesiarchy's tithes were late, or where once loyal governors delayed the construction of cathedrals for resource reasons. Ordo Hereticus agents spoke of strange silences in the warp, of pilgrims who vanished in transit between shrine systems, of confessions from rogue psychers that spoke of saints whose eyes had turned to ash. At first, the Sororitas acted as they always had, deploying small surgical forces to investigate and, if necessary, purge. The pattern was clear. Isolated heresies, swiftly rooted out. But the tremors grew. Across the length and breadth of the Segmentum Pacificus, planetary faith seemed to be rotting from within. The Dalmine Crusade was one of the first flashpoints. Dalmine Secundus, a bastion world with a basilica that had stood since the Age of Apostasy, fell suddenly silent. No astropathic reply came to the ecclesiarchy's calls. A force of 3,000 Sororitas, led by Canonist Preceptor Sabine Corinth, was dispatched alongside a small detachment of Imperial Guard. What they found on arrival was not defiance, but emptiness. Cities stood abandoned, markets strewn with dust. Only in the great basilica did they find life, if life it could be called. Tens of thousands of kneeling figures, still and silent, their skin mottled like marble, eyes rolled back into pure white. At the base of the altar sat the planetary governor, weeping blood, whispering prayers to an entity whose name was not the Emperor's. The purge lasted 3 days. None were left to reclaim the planet. It was declared perdita and quarantined, but the psychic stink of whatever had infested it lingered in the void for decades. Conflicts like Dalmine gnawed at the Sororitas in ways that orc sieges or chaos cult hunts never could. The foe here was not loud, not crude, but insidious, and as the threats shifted, so too did the Sororitas' methods. Convent prioresses began ordering more cloistered study of obscure heretical texts, not for devotion, but for countermeasure. Chapels aboard their ships grew quieter, not for lack of prayer, but because prayers were sharpened into weapons, honed with the precision of a blade. The Order's dialogues became critical in these years, decoding the cryptic symbols and half-forgotten languages in which the new heresies cloaked themselves. The Order's Hospitaller, once devoted almost purely to battlefield triage, took on a darker role, examining the bodies of the corrupted dead for signs of infection, be it spiritual, psychic, or biological. And yet, even as the Sororitas adapted, the enemy learned. In the Balthus Rift, Sisters Famulus embedded in noble courts began vanishing one by one, replaced by impostors whose every gesture mirrored the original, save for the faintest hesitation when the Emperor's name was spoken. On the mining moon of Kester 9, a single sermon from a visiting preacher was enough to ignite a rebellion that slaughtered every Imperial agent on world in less than a day. The preacher's words had been nothing but orthodox litanies, and yet somehow they had carried a hidden contagion, a psychic venom wound within the syllables themselves. The Order's Pronatus, guardians of relics and sacred objects, began quarantining not just alien artifacts, but even Imperial saint banners if their provenance could not be verified. Faith was under siege, not from without, but from within its own veins. By the dawn of M39, the Adeptus Sororitas were no longer simply the hammer of the ecclesiarchy. They had become its shield against subtle, soul-gnawing threats. Convictions deepened into unbreakable certainties. Where once they might have sought to redeem the wavering, now hesitation was deemed an unaffordable risk. Across multiple campaigns, canonesses issued the same decree. Faith does not falter. Those who falter were never faithful. This was not cruelty, but the cold arithmetic of survival. Against enemies who could twist the very meaning of prayer, there could be no middle ground. The wars of this era were rarely clean victories. In the purging of Enoch Prime, 3 full preceptories of the Order of Our Martyred Lady fought for 6 months through poisoned catacombs and hive spires, where the air shimmered with warp-born hallucinations. They won the world back, but only by burning its primary hive to slag. Of the 20,000 Sororitas who landed, less than 8,000 departed. Their losses were not mourned as waste. They were honoured as the necessary coin with which purity was bought. The same pattern repeated on dozens of worlds, victories measured in ash and empty cities. In these long campaigns, technology and doctrine fused more tightly than ever before. The sanctified promethium of the Sororitas flamers became more than a weapon. It was a sacrament, a purifying fire not just for the body but for the soul. Bolt weapons were inscribed with microscriptures between campaigns, so that every detonation carried not just explosive mass, but a litany's worth of righteous invocation. Even their armour took on a new character, more reliquaries mounted on breastplates, more personal relics integrated into the very ceramite, so that the sister's faith was literally wrapped around her as she marched into the dark. And yet, for all their adaptability, the Sororitas could not stem every tide. The Thassalon expanse burned for a decade despite the deployment of 5 orders militant. The Rimwood Saint Crusade, intended to reclaim 8 shrine worlds, succeeded in taking only 3 before collapsing under logistical strain and psychic sabotage. The galaxy was changing and not in the Imperium's favour. It was in this crucible of creeping disaster that the Adeptus Sororitas began to forge a new identity. Not a replacement for their origins, but a hardening of their essence. They were not merely warriors of the ecclesiarchy. They were the last bastion against an enemy that could walk unseen through the corridors of sanctity. In sermons delivered from the prows of battle barges, canonesses began to speak of the Sororitas as the wall of fire between the flock and the night. The metaphor was apt. Fire consumes, fire purifies, and fire, if it falters, leaves nothing but cold ruin. But the night was growing deeper. Warp storms flared in patterns the Adeptus Astra Telepathica could not predict. Xenos incursions struck far beyond their normal ranges, and most troublingly, the old heresies thought extinguished began to stir once more. Names whispered in the ecclesiarch's court, Vandir, Apostasia, Nova Terra, were spoken not in reverence but as omens. The Sororitas, it seemed, were not merely fighting the future, but the shadows of the past. And in the deepest cloisters of Ophelia 7, where the grandest cathedrals rose like mountains of stone and gold, certain prioresses began to fear that the enemies the Sororitas had faced thus far were but rehearsals, that the true test of their unbreakable faith had yet to come. For faith is strongest when it is tested. But what if the test is endless? War in the Imperium is a constant, a ceaseless ocean of blood and ash. But for the Adeptus Sororitas, it is something more. A crucible in which faith is tested, refined, and made unbreakable. They are not merely drawn to the flames of conflict. They are called to them, summoned by the will of the ecclesiarchy and the perceived whispers of the God-Emperor himself. And yet, in this endless tide of battle, there are moments that stand apart, campaigns that sear themselves into the annals of their orders, forging legends from the screams of the dying and the prayers of the faithful. It is in these trials by fire that the sisters reveal both the strength and the fragility of their creed. The Orphean Wars of the early 39th millennium were one such trial. When the Orphean Deeps, an isolated cluster of worlds far from the main arteries of imperial travel, fell under the shadow of the Necron awakening, the Imperium's response was slow, burdened by bureaucracy and the competing agendas of segmentum commands. Yet the Sororitas moved with speed and certainty, for the ecclesiarchy's influence on the frontier was waning, and here was an opportunity to remind the faithful that the Emperor's servants would not abandon them. Orders militant from 3 different convents answered the call, converging on the shattered shrine worlds of the deeps. They fought not for the strategic value of the systems, they had little enough of that, but for the souls of the pilgrims, the preservation of relics, and the public demonstration that faith still had champions. In these wars, the sisters faced an enemy unlike the heretics and mutants of the hive cities. The Necrons were silent and relentless, immune to fear, immune to the psychological warfare that faith often wrought upon mortal foes. The hymns that could unnerve a chaos cultist or sway the morale of guard regiments meant nothing to the living metal legions. It was a war stripped to its most brutal fundamentals: bolter against necrodermis, melter against monolith, flame against the cold infinity of the void. For many sisters, it was a revelation, a humbling reminder that the Emperor's light could not burn away the soulless. And yet they fought, for to do otherwise was unthinkable. It was on the world of Sacrament Prime that the most decisive engagement of the Orphean campaign unfolded. The city of Tarsis Basilica, a sprawling cathedral hive whose spires scraped the cloud layer, had been besieged for 17 days. The Necron phalanxes advanced with mechanical precision, each push inexorable. Within the great basilica itself, Canoness Superior Agatha Vera held council with her commanders. She did not speak of surrender or evacuation. To her, the loss of the basilica was a heresy against memory itself. The vaults beneath its altar held relics dating back to the reign of blood, objects steeped in centuries of veneration. To abandon them to Xenos defilement was inconceivable. The counterattack she ordered that night was nothing short of suicidal. At the 12th toll of the basilica's bells, the sisters emerged from the defensive lines, advancing in perfect order down the broken avenues toward the Necron assault columns. Liturgies of wrath rolled from their tongues, bolters barked, and the air filled with the incandescent arcs of melterfire. Repentia surged forward in howling, chain-blade-wielding packs, carving into the enemy ranks with desperate fury. Immolators burned pathways through the alien formations, their flames licking against unyielding metal, leaving blackened and molten wrecks. The fighting continued until dawn, when the Necron advance was halted not by annihilation, but by some inscrutable calculation, an enemy decision to withdraw without explanation. To the Sororitas, it was a sign, a miracle delivered in the moment of greatest need. To the more pragmatic commanders of the Astra Militarum, it was an anomaly. But to the faithful, interpretation was never in doubt. It is in such battles that the Adeptus Sororitas' dual nature is revealed. Warriors and worshippers, martyrs and tacticians. They do not measure victory solely in territory gained or enemies slain, but in relics preserved, symbols upheld, and faith renewed. And yet, the toll is terrible. The Orphean Wars claimed thousands of sisters, many entombed in the rubble of the very shrines they fought to defend. Memorials were erected on distant worlds, and the names of the fallen became refrains in the litanies of later crusades. But not all trials by fire come in the form of alien invasion. Some are far closer to home, within the Imperium itself. The age of apostasy may have passed into history, but its shadow lingers in the constant vigilance of the Sororitas against the creeping corruption of the ecclesiarchy. There are times when their bolters must be turned upon the very priests they serve, for heresy is a weed that grows fastest in the richest soil of faith. The purge of the Gathalamor schism in M41 is one of the most infamous examples. When the ecclesiarchal synod of Gathalamor began preaching the divinity of their own planetary saint above the emperor, it was the Sisters of the Argent Shroud who descended upon the capital. Their attack was swift and without compromise. Temples were stormed, idols torn down, and the false priesthood executed before the high altar. It was a grim reminder to all who served the ecclesiarchy. The Adeptus Sororitas are not merely guardians of the faithful, they are executioners of the faithless, no matter how ornate their robes. Through these trials, the Sisters' Creed becomes both steel and scar. They emerge from each conflict transformed, their methods refined, their vows reaffirmed. Yet each battle also adds to the ledger of loss. Their ranks are not limitless, and every sister who falls takes with her years of discipline, prayer, and experience. This tension between their mortal fragility and their unyielding mission is perhaps the most poignant truth of their existence. They are human, and they will die, but they fight as though immortality waits in the Emperor's embrace. The enemies they face are as varied as the galaxy itself: Xenos empires, renegade worlds, cult uprisings, demonic incursions, but all are refracted through the same lens: opposition to the Emperor's will. Whether standing against the horror of a tyrannid swarm or the whispered corruption of a chaos cult, the Sororitas bring the same weapons: faith, fire, and discipline. It is this consistency that makes them so feared and so respected. No matter the foe, no matter the theatre of war, the sisters arrive as an unyielding wall of conviction. yet the galaxy changes, and with it, the nature of their trials. The opening of the Great Rift in the dawn of the 42nd millennium would present challenges beyond anything the Orders had endured before, a tearing of reality itself that cast whole sectors into eternal night, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon. In such darkness, even the most steadfast faith can flicker. But that is another story, one that waits beyond the fires of the present chapter. For now, it is enough to see them as they are in the crucible, tested, tempered, and for the moment, unbroken. The trials by fire are never truly over. They end only when the last sister falls, the last hymn fades, and the last relic lies shattered in the dust. Until then, they march toward the next blaze, certain that within its heat lies both their purpose and their end. The opening of the Great Rift tore through the fabric of the Imperium like a wound that would never heal. What was once a vast and unbroken expanse of Imperial space was sundered by a gaping chasm of warp storm and darkness so profound that entire systems vanished from the Emperor's guiding light. For the Adeptus Sororitas, this was not merely a strategic catastrophe, it was an existential trial that struck at the very heart of their faith. The beacon of the Astronomicon, that guiding flame for humanity, flickered and waned behind the storm's veil, leaving countless worlds isolated, vulnerable, and afraid. Into this suffocating void stepped the sisters, unbowed and unbroken. But the fires that once purified with holy light now burned amid shadows that twisted and gnawed at the soul. The fabric of reality was stretched thin, and the Sororitas found themselves battling enemies not just of flesh and metal, but of nightmare and madness. The forces of chaos surged with newfound fury, their demonic hosts spilling into the void's shattered edges. Xenos raiders exploited the confusion, carving out kingdoms from the fractured remains of imperial order. Even within their own ranks, doubt and fear took root as communications failed and reinforcements could not come. The siege of Sanctum Vox was emblematic of the grim reality now faced by the Adeptus Sororitas. Sanctum Vox was a shrine world perched on the edge of the rift, renowned for its towering cathedrals and the purity of its liturgies. When the initial warp storms rolled in, the world's connection to Terra was severed. The Ecclesiarchy's emissaries, once confident and assured, became isolated commanders trapped in a crucible of terror. The sisters who defended Sanctum Vox held their lines against increasingly desperate waves of chaos cultists and warp-spawned monstrosities. Their prayers echoed through cathedrals turned battlegrounds, a litany against despair. Canoness Superior, Helena Voss was a figure both revered and feared for her unyielding command during the siege. Her voice was said to cut through the chaos like a beacon, rallying her sisters even as her own faith was tested. Under her leadership, the defenders enacted rituals that melded technology, and the sacred deploying blessed incensers that emitted purifying smoke and bolters engraved with prayers said to burn the very essence of demons. But these miracles were costly. The sisters suffered grievous losses, and even their revered relics were not immune to the warp's corrupting touch. The siege lasted 7 months, ending only when reinforcements from a shattered Imperial fleet finally breached the rift's edge. The siege of Sanctum Vox revealed a brutal truth. The Adeptus Sororitas were no longer merely the Emperor's righteous hammer, they were a bulwark against oblivion itself. Yet this revelation came with a price. The prolonged conflict strained their numbers, depleted their sacred relics, and introduced fissures of doubt into the tightly woven tapestry of faith that had sustained them for centuries. In whispered confessions beneath vaulted ceilings, sisters spoke of dreams where the Emperor's light dimmed and voices that were not his called to them from the darkness. The Order's Hospitaller faced a particularly harrowing test during these dark days. As battlefields stretched and the wounded multiplied, their sacred apothecaries were overwhelmed not only by physical injuries, but by souls twisted by warp-induced madness. Traditional rites of healing proved insufficient. Sisters in white bore witness to comrades consumed by unseen torments. Some Hospitallers took it upon themselves to delve into forbidden remedies, exploring ancient, barely comprehensible texts that straddled the line between healing and sorcery. This pursuit, while born of necessity, planted seeds of controversy that would reverberate through the Orders for centuries to come. Amidst these trials, the Order's dialogues endeavoured to maintain cohesion and clarity. The fracturing of imperial space meant that doctrines fractured too, with local interpretations diverging in isolated pockets. The dialogues undertook the monumental task of consolidating fragmented faiths, sending envoys into shadowed worlds to unify belief under the ever-watchful gaze of the ecclesiarchy. Their efforts were heroic but incomplete. By the end of the century, dozens of worlds had splintered into sects whose dogma bordered on heresy, each claiming to be the true voice of the Emperor. The darkness of the rift also revealed stark divisions within the Adeptus Sororitas themselves. Some sisters advocated for greater militancy, arguing that only through overwhelming force could the Imperium's enemies be crushed. Others urged caution, stressing the need to preserve the soul of the sisterhood against the corrosive influence of endless war. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally flaring into open debate within the convents. The once unassailable unity of the orders now bore cracks that threatened to fracture their sacred purpose. Meanwhile, the Imperium's High Lords watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and unease. The Sororitas had become indispensable guardians of faith and fortress worlds, but their growing autonomy and the shadowy nature of the threats they faced made them unpredictable. To some, the sisterhood represented a beacon of hope. To others, a reminder of how thin the veneer of order had become. Secret edicts were whispered through the halls of terror, reminding the ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Sororitas alike that loyalty to the Imperium was paramount, and that faith, however fiery, must never eclipse obedience. The longer the rift remained open, the more the Adeptus Sororitas transformed. They evolved from defenders of shrines into keepers of an ancient flame threatened by cosmic darkness. Their once clear battle lines blurred. Their hymns rang out in places where no light could reach. In this shadowed era, the sisters were both warriors and wardens, charged with safeguarding not only physical worlds, but the fragile sanctity of the imperial soul itself. Yet even as they stood vigilant, a chilling question began to haunt the highest echelons of the sisterhood. What if the greatest threat was not from without, but from within? The whispered rumours of corruption, of rogue sisters seduced by forbidden knowledge, of prioresses whose visions veered into fanaticism, suggested a slow decay beneath the surface of faith. The very fire that burned so brightly threatened to consume its keepers, and the spectre of schism loomed over a sisterhood that had long defined itself through unity. As the darkness deepened, the Adeptus Sororitas found themselves at a crossroads. They could either become an unyielding wall of flame, burning everything in their path to ash, including their own ideals, or adapt, and risk losing the purity that had made them the Emperor's chosen daughters. The choice was not theirs alone. The fate of the Imperium itself seemed to hang in the balance, and so the sisters marched onward, into the shadow and the storm, bound by vows of iron and faith, their prayers aflame against the void. The fire would burn, but for how long? The crucible of damnation was not a battle fought on a single field, nor a war waged in the conventional sense. It was a cataclysm of faith, loyalty, and ideology that shattered the Adeptus Sororitas from within as much as it battered them from without. The events that unfolded during the War of the Black Chalice would come to define an era, a turning point after which the sisterhood would never again be the unassailable force they once appeared to be. It was a conflict born not of alien invasion or chaos incursion, but of human treachery, doctrinal schism, and the slow poison of fanaticism twisted to madness. The War of the Black Chalice erupted in the wake of the Great Rift's opening, when communication between isolated segments of the Imperium fractured completely. Among the worlds caught in the Rift's shadow was the forge world of Exordium Prime, a world of blazing forges and endless industry. Here, the local ecclesiarchy grew increasingly insular and radicalized, inspired by prophecies surrounding a fabled artifact, the Black Chalice, said to grant visions of the Emperor's ultimate will. The tale of the Chalice was old, buried, deep within the archives of the Order's dialogues, dismissed by many as apocryphal, but on Exordium Prime, it became a catalyst for madness. The prioress of Exordium, Sister Malus Var, declared herself the vessel of the Chalice's power. Under her command, the convent began purging anyone who questioned her visions, branding dissenters as heretics or worse. The once harmonious order fractured, as loyal sisters found themselves hunted by those who claimed divine mandate. These events quickly escalated beyond the convent's walls, spilling into the planetary capital and sparking a violent civil war that engulfed the Forge world. What made this conflict unique was the way in which faith itself became weaponized, turned against its own bearers with merciless precision. Sister fought sister, and the hallowed halls of the Adeptus Sororitas convents echoed with the clash of chainswords and the wails of the betrayed. The ecclesiarch was forced to send urgent appeals for aid, and reinforcements from other orders militant were dispatched. But even these arrivals found themselves caught in the maelstrom of zealotry and suspicion. Every sister was a potential foe, every prayer a test of loyalty. The heart of the War of the Black Chalice was a terrible irony. The sisters who had dedicated their lives to preserving the purity of the Emperor's faith found themselves divided by competing interpretations of that very faith. The chalice, intended as a symbol of divine guidance, became an emblem of division. Documents recovered from the conflict reveal cryptic passages and visions that seem to predict the coming of a terrible purging fire, an apocalyptic reckoning that would leave the Imperium cleansed or destroyed. Some interpreted this as a call to absolute purification, others as a warning to temper zeal with mercy. The conflict reached its horrific climax in the siege of the Cathedral of Eternal Flame, the principal sanctuary on Exordium Prime. As Sister Malis and her loyalists entrenched themselves within the cathedral's towering spires, they prepared to enact a ritual said to bring the chalice's prophecy to fruition. The opposing forces, sisters who sought to end the madness and restore order, laid siege for months, locked in brutal combat where the line between prayer and madness blurred. Flames, both literal and spiritual, consumed the cathedral in the final days. When the dust settled, few survivors remained. Sister Malis was found in the ruins, clutching the shattered remnants of the Black Chalice, her mind broken but her faith unshaken. The ecclesiarchy decreed the chalice an accursed relic, its history erased from official records, and the convent on Exordium Prime was disbanded. Yet the scars ran deeper than the physical destruction. The War of the Black Chalice exposed vulnerabilities within the Adeptus Sororitas structure and doctrine, vulnerabilities born of an unyielding faith that could not accommodate doubt, and a hierarchical system that allowed fanaticism to metastasize unchecked. In the aftermath, debates raged within the highest councils of the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition. Some argued that the Adeptus Sororitas must be more tightly controlled, their zeal tempered by stricter oversight to prevent similar catastrophes. Others warned that such interference risked diluting the very essence of what made the sisters formidable, their unwavering devotion and autonomy. The tension between control and faith remains a defining fault line within the Imperium to this day. Technologically, the War of the Black Chalice saw grim innovations. The sisters introduced relic-based countermeasures to detect psychic corruption, and developed enhanced purity seals inscribed with wards designed to resist warp influence. However, these tools were double-edged. Some sisters, desperate to shield themselves from the madness that had torn Exordium Prime apart, began relying on forbidden technologies and arcane rites, blurring the lines between faith and sorcery. This dangerous synthesis sparked suspicion and further internal divisions, raising questions about how far the Adeptus Sororitas might stray in pursuit of purity. Philosophically, the War of the Black Chalice forced a reckoning with the nature of faith itself. The Adeptus Sororitas had long believed that faith was absolute, that the Emperor's will was singular and unambiguous. But the visions inspired by the chalice, and the bloody schism they caused, revealed the dangers of such certainty. When faith becomes dogma untethered from reason, it becomes a weapon that can turn inward, destroying the very pillars it was meant to uphold. And yet, for all its tragedy, the crucible of damnation was also a forge of renewal. From the ashes rose a redefined sisterhood, one wary of unchecked zealotry but still fiercely committed to the Emperor's cause. The ecclesiarchy codified new doctrines emphasizing vigilance against corruption, even within their own ranks, and established more rigorous protocols for the investigation of relics and visions. The Order's dialogues undertook a monumental effort to recover and safeguard lost knowledge, to prevent the re-emergence of secret heresies. The War of the Black Chalice thus stands as a grim testament to the paradox at the heart of the Adeptus Sororitas, that their greatest strength, their unbreakable faith, is also their greatest vulnerability. Their creed, forged in flame and blood, demands absolute loyalty but struggles to tolerate dissent. They are guardians of purity, Yet purity itself proves elusive and dangerous. This crucible of damnation would shape their future, leaving indelible marks upon their souls and their armour alike. And yet, as the Imperium's darkest centuries unfolded, the Sisters marched on, scarred but unbowed, their prayers rising like smoke from the battlefields, their chainswords singing the hymn of the Emperor's wrath. For in the galaxy of endless war, faith must be both shield and sword, and the price of failure is oblivion. The aftermath of the War of the Black Chalice left the Adeptus Sororitas forever altered, not only in structure and doctrine but in the very soul of their sisterhood. The echoes of that bitter conflict resonated through the towering cathedrals and war-torn worlds where they served, a constant reminder that faith, once fractured, is never easily mended. Yet from these ashes of devastation, a legacy was forged, one as fierce and unyielding as the flame that had both consumed and purified them. In the decades that followed, the Adeptus Sororitas emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, tempered by the hard lessons of schism and sacrifice. Their ranks were replenished through rigorous recruitment from the most devout worlds, where young women took their vows not merely as a call to arms, but as an embrace of an eternal covenant. Each sister carried the weight of history, the memory of those lost in madness and fire, and the burden of a future shrouded in uncertainty. Their vows deepened, bound by oaths of purity, obedience, and unwavering loyalty to the Emperor's will. But this renewal was not without cost. The rigid discipline that followed bred suspicion and intolerance within the orders. Sisters were trained to be vigilant not only against external foes, but also against potential corruption within their own ranks. The shadow of the Black Chalice hung over every convent, a silent accusation that the smallest crack in faith could unleash ruin. This vigilance fostered an atmosphere of austere scrutiny, where even whispered doubts could be treated as seeds of heresy. The warmth of fellowship was often replaced by the cold steel of suspicion. Technological innovation continued in the wake of the conflict, merging sacred tradition with brutal pragmatism. The armour of the Sisters was reforged in the forges of Mars and blessed in the chapels of Terra, incorporating new wards and relics designed to shield the wearer from psychic assault and warp corruption. Weaponry was inscribed with renewed fervour. Every bolter shell, every flamer's burst carried the weight of centuries-old litanies. The Order's militant refined their battle doctrines, emphasizing precision, coordinated strikes, and the ruthless eradication of heresy before it could take root. Yet the legacy of the War of the Black Chalice extended beyond the physical. The ecclesiarchy, scarred by the spectacle of sisters turning upon sisters, imposed stricter oversight on the Adeptus Sororitas. New offices of penitence were established to investigate and purge corruption, working alongside the Order Hereticus and Inquisition. This alliance brought increased scrutiny but also greater resources, enabling the sisters to root out subtle threats hidden within the Imperium's vast shadows. Philosophically, the Adeptus Sororitas grappled with the paradox of their existence. The war had revealed that absolute faith could be both salvation and damnation. They were warriors of light, yet light cast shadows. Their unbreakable faith required unyielding obedience, yet obedience demanded discernment. The balance between zealotry and mercy became a central tenet of their doctrine, a tension that shaped every sermon, every prayer, every battlefield decision. This evolution was embodied in the reforms of Canoness Preceptor Elena Vereth, who emerged as a defining figure in the decades after the war. She championed a vision of the sisterhood that embraced both the fiery wrath necessary to purge corruption and the tempered grace required to sustain hope. Under her guidance, the Order's militant adopted a doctrine that valued discipline and faith, but also the wisdom to recognize when to wield the sword and when to offer mercy. Her writings became foundational texts, studied in every convent and recited in the quiet hours of vigil. The sisters also expanded their roles beyond the battlefield. In worlds ravaged by war and despair, they became beacons of hope and healing, rebuilding shattered communities and rekindling the flickering embers of faith. Their acts of mercy became as legendary as their deeds of war, reminding the Imperium that the Emperor's light was not only a weapon but a promise. Yet beneath this legacy of renewal and hope lay an undercurrent of unease. The galaxy remained a maelstrom of war and chaos. The Great Rift endured, and with it the threat of corruption and madness that had sparked the War of the Black Chalice. Whispers persisted of hidden cults, rogue sisters who delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge, and relics whose true power was lost to time. The sisters knew that their legacy was not static but a living struggle, a ceaseless battle not only against enemies without but against the shadows within. In this context, the Adeptus Sororitas stand as both monument and warning. They embody the paradox of faith in a galaxy where hope is scarce and war eternal. Their fiery conviction lights the darkest corners of the Imperium, yet that same flame threatens to consume all it touches. The legacy of the Black Chalice is not merely history, it is a living challenge, a constant reminder that purity must be guarded with vigilance, and that the line between sanctity and fanaticism is perilously thin. As the Imperium marches relentlessly onward, the sisters' prayers rise like smoke from the burning battlefields, a litany of defiance against the encroaching night. They are the Emperor's daughters, fiery, divine, unbreakable, but their story is far from over. Their legacy is a flame that will either purify or destroy, and in the end, only the fire will decide.